If you cannot keep up, maybe it is time to step aside. The new vice president said it with a smirk, like he was delivering a clever line he had practiced on the drive-in. His name was Greg Myers. He had been with the company for 9 months. I had been there for 15 years. I ran the encryption systems department from the ground up, starting when we were just a handful of programmers working in a cramped room with folding chairs. Every security protocol, every compliance audit, and every emergency patch that kept regulators and clients off our backs had gone through my desk. I looked at him, nodded once, and said that I understood. That simple response seemed to throw him off. Greg expected an argument, a plea, maybe even tears. Instead, I thanked him politely, shut down my terminal, handed my security badge to Human Resources, and walked out without another word. Greg fired me on a Tuesday afternoon, right after the weekly executive sync. He did not even bother to close the blinds in the conference room. It had floor-to-ceiling glass, giving a full view of my team outside. These were people I had hired, trained, and protected from corporate bureaucracy for years. He leaned back in his leather chair, hands folded, showing a confidence that was borrowed rather than earned. He explained that they were modernizing leadership, and that while my approach was solid, it was dated. He claimed they needed speed and flexibility. I almost laughed. Our department handled classified-grade encryption for major financial institutions, defense contractors, and 2 federal agencies. Speed without precision was not innovation in our line of work, it was negligence. But I did not say that to him. I did not remind him that 3 months earlier, I had personally stopped a major breach attempt that would have triggered international reporting requirements. Or that the encryption framework he bragged about in investor meetings was built on an algorithm I designed during my 7th year, when the company was still finding its footing. None of that mattered anymore. The human resources representatives slid the termination packet toward me like a menu. There was no cause listed, just organizational restructuring. Greg stood up, clearly done with the meeting. He offered to have someone walk me out if I needed help transitioning. I told him there was no need, as I knew my way around the building. I shut down my terminal myself, logged out, and closed everything cleanly. I did not delete files, sabotage systems, or warn anyone. I just left. In the elevator, my reflection looked calm. Too calm, maybe. 15 years is a long time to give a company your brain, your weekends, and your nights. But I had learned something early in my career. Panic makes you sloppy, and silence gives you space. At home, I set my bag down, poured a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table. There was no anger or shock, only absolute clarity. Greg Myers had made a very specific mistake. He had fired me without cause. Most people assume that means severance and hurt feelings. In my case, it meant contracts. Back in my 10th year, after a particularly brutal compliance audit that I had single-handedly resolved, the board of directors had approved a retention agreement for senior technical leadership. It was the kind of contract no one reads unless something goes wrong. One clause in that agreement covered intellectual property created prior to a specific restructuring year. Another addressed patent assignment conditions. A third, buried deep in complex legal language, covered reversion rights if termination occurred without cause. At the time, it was framed as a theoretical safeguard, something that would never actually matter. Greg never asked about it. He did not consult the legal team before firing me. He did not ask why the patent filings for our core encryption engine listed my name, Tom Miller, as the primary architect rather than a corporate assignee in the early drafts. He assumed tenure meant replaceable. By midnight, I had pulled the old agreement from my encrypted personal archive. It was still valid, never superseded, and never voided. The document was clear. By 2 in the morning, I had my attorney, Howard Reynolds, on the phone. He did not say much at first, just breathed slowly as he read the scanned pages I had sent him. He asked me when they had fired me. I told him it had happened yesterday, without cause. There was another long pause on the line. Howard then told me that as of midnight, the ownership status of the encryption framework had become complicated. By 4:30 in the morning, the formal paperwork was prepared and filed with the registry. At 6 o'clock in the morning, my phone started vibrating non-stop on the nightstand. Calls were coming from my former director, from compliance managers, from the legal department, and from numbers I did not recognize. Voicemails were stacking faster than I could listen to them. One message stood out among the rest. It came from a board liaison I barely knew, named Sarah Collins. Her voice was strained, asking me to call her immediately because there was confusion about the encryption patent. She wanted to know since when I owned it. I stared at the screen, coffee cooling in my hand, thinking that I had owned it since the moment they decided I was expendable. By the time the sun came up, the company I had built my career inside was waking up to a problem it could not solve internally. And Greg Myers, the man who told me to step aside, was about to learn what happens when you fire the only person who knows where the foundations are buried. By the time the morning settled in, my phone had stopped vibrating and started demanding constant attention. I had not answered anything yet, not because I was avoiding them, but because I needed to hear the shape of their panic before I spoke. Silence has a way of forcing people to reveal what they actually know. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to the voicemails in order. The first wave was predictable. My former director was trying to sound steady while clearly being terrified. The human resources representatives used soft corporate language that did not match the urgency underneath it. Compliance managers asked for clarification in voices trained to never admit fear on a recorded line. Then the messages changed. A senior corporate legal counsel left a voicemail that skipped pleasantries entirely. He sounded like someone who had just discovered a structural crack in a building. Everyone was still working inside. He stated that they were seeing an issue with the patent registry. My name, Tom Miller, was appearing as the current owner of the Core Shield encryption frameworks. He said that did not align with their records and asked me to call him back immediately. Core Shield was just the marketing name they had chosen. Internally, we had always called it Aegis. It was my own architecture, not merely a corporate asset. Marketing could rename it all they wanted, but the foundation did not care. Another message followed, rushed and barely coherent, from the head of Information Technology Security. He said they were getting licensing validation warnings across the network. Systems were operational for now, but compliance flags were escalating rapidly. They needed to understand what had changed. Nothing had changed, and that was exactly the issue. A text message arrived next from Sarah Collins, the board liaison. I had met her maybe twice in 15 years, both times in rooms where people spoke carefully and pretended not to notice who actually carried the technical weight. She asked me to confirm whether I had initiated a patent reversion filing, as the board was asking questions. I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone down and called my attorney. Howard answered on the first ring. He told me they had realized what was happening. I told him that discovery was inevitable. Once the legal team checked the registry, it became impossible to contain. Encryption tied to highly regulated clients does not stay quiet for long. I asked him if we were exposed anywhere. Howard assured me that we were not, and that the company was the one exposed. He warned me that they would try to make me blink, but I did not. I returned exactly one call. I did not call Human Resources or the corporate counsel. I called Sarah Collins, the board liaison. She answered immediately, thanking me for calling back and stating that they needed to understand what was happening. I asked her which part she wanted to discuss. There was a pause. Then she gave a careful response. She said the board was informed that ownership of the encryption patent appeared to have reverted, but they had not been informed that my employment had ended. That explained the internal disconnect. I told her that the board clearly did not have the full picture. She asked if I had filed the reversion. I told her that I had, because I was terminated without cause, and the retention agreement allowed it under the legal doctrine of failure of consideration. The original assignment contract was contingent on my continued employment and role preservation. By terminating me without cause, the company failed to provide the agreed consideration, rendering the assignment void ab initio. Under federal patent rules, the rights reverted to the inventor immediately. Silence followed my explanation. I could hear pages turning and keys clicking in the background. Sarah finally said that the clause was old. I replied that old did not mean invalid. It only meant forgotten. She exhaled slowly and said the board would like to speak with me in person. I told her I would be available later that day once their legal team finished reading the documents they should have read years ago. She did not argue because she knew she could not. The rest of the morning unfolded through forwarded emails and quiet messages from people still inside the building. Greg Myers had walked into absolute chaos. Compliance had frozen all non-essential deployments, and security teams were auditing systems that had not changed in years. Someone had finally pulled the original filings and realized my name was central to everything. A former team lead texted me from a personal number, telling me they were asking who had the authority to approve encryption use. The legal department was saying no one did until the ownership issue was resolved, and Greg was pacing his office. That was good to hear. Human Resources sent a formal email asking me to clarify my intentions, which I ignored. Eventually, Sarah Collins called back. She said the board chair, the legal counsel, the chief technology officer, and Greg Myers wanted to meet with me at a private conference suite downtown. I told her I would be there. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet and let the situation settle. Running a department for 15 years teaches you that systems do not respond to authority titles. They respond to permissions, contracts, and rules. Ignore those, and everything stops working. The board did not meet at headquarters. That alone told me how serious things had become. They chose a private conference suite in a business hotel downtown, the kind executives use when they do not want conversations overheard by assistants or recorded by internal systems. It was neutral territory with controlled access and no audience. When I arrived, the legal counsel was already there. Laptops were open, and documents were spread across the table like evidence. The chief technology officer, Frank Harris, sat near the window, staring at the city instead of his screen. He looked exhausted, like someone watching a complex machine he understood slowly unravel. Greg Myers arrived last, walking in with the same false confidence he had worn the day before, but his smile was much tighter. His eyes moved too fast, checking faces and looking for reassurance that no one offered. The board chair, Walter Cooper, did not waste time. He nodded for me to sit and thanked me for coming on short notice. I replied that it seemed important. Greg shot me a look which I ignored. Walter folded his hands and stated that they had reviewed the patent filings and the employment agreement tied to my role. He confirmed that their legal team had verified the reversion clause was active. Greg leaned forward, arguing that this was being blown out of proportion. He called it an administrative issue and claimed that I had filed something I should not have. The lead attorney did not even look at Greg, stating calmly that the filing was valid and the trigger condition of termination without cause had been met. Greg frowned, arguing that I ran a department but did not own the company's intellectual property. I spoke before the legal team could. I told Greg that I did not own all of it, but I owned the encryption architecture I designed before the assignment terms changed. The contract allowed for reversion under the doctrine of failure of consideration if the company terminated me without cause. Since they had done exactly that, the assignment was void ab initio, and the rights reverted to me. Walter turned to Greg and asked why I was fired without cause. Greg straightened, claiming it was for leadership restructuring and performance alignment. Frank Harris, the chief technology officer, finally spoke up, stating that was not a cause, but a preference. Greg bristled, saying they needed faster decision-making and new perspectives. Frank asked him quietly if he meant unregulated encryption, adding that you do not speed things up by removing the only person who understands every failure mode. Silence followed. Walter rubbed his temple and asked Greg if he had consulted the legal team before the termination. Greg hesitated just long enough before saying no, claiming it was within his authority. Walter replied that it was within his authority to terminate, but not to expose the company to this level of risk. I had not said a word in over a minute. I did not need to say anything. The lead attorney cleared his throat and explained that the company did not have the right to deploy, modify, or demonstrate the Core Shield framework without my authorization, and doing so would constitute willful infringement. Greg scoffed, asking if they had to ask permission from a former employee to run their own systems. The attorney corrected him, saying they had to ask permission from the patent holder, who happened to be me. Walter looked at me directly and asked what I wanted. It was the question everyone dances around until they cannot anymore. I told him I wanted clarity and accountability. Greg laughed once, a sharp and dismissive sound, calling it retaliation. I replied that it was governance, which was something he had skipped. Walter raised a hand, stopping Greg before he could speak again, and asked me what clarity looked like. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table in a calm and measured way. I stated that first, the board must formally acknowledge that the encryption architecture is my intellectual property under the current legal framework. The legal team nodded, as they already had. Second, I required that any use of that architecture be governed by a strict licensing agreement with transparent terms and proper oversight. Frank Harris exhaled, looking relieved, as this was a solvable technical problem. Greg shook his head, calling it insane, and claiming I was undermining the company. I told him that I had kept the company compliant for 15 years, while he had undermined it in a single afternoon. Walter's gaze did not leave mine as he asked about the third condition. I did not rush my reply. I stated that the person who made the decision to terminate me should not be overseeing the systems affected by it. Greg froze, telling me I could not be serious. I told him I was, because firing the architect of the core system without understanding what he was touching was not leadership, it was liability. The room went completely still. Walter leaned back, considering the situation, while the legal team avoided looking at Greg. Frank Harris spoke again, his voice steady as he said that if Greg remained in his role, every technical decision he touched would be questioned internally and externally, which the company could not afford. Greg stood up, asking if they were choosing me over him. Walter stood as well, stating they were choosing stability. Greg looked around the room, waiting for support that never came. He muttered that he was hired to modernize the place. Walter replied that he was, right up until he decided to remove the wrong load-bearing wall. Greg left the room without another word, letting the heavy door click shut behind him. When he was gone, the tension in the room shifted. It was not gone, but it was now manageable. Walter looked back at me and asked if we agreed to the terms, whether I would license the system back immediately. I told him I would, because I did not want the company to fail. I wanted it to function. Frank Harris nodded, and the legal team began outlining the next steps. As the meeting wrapped up, Walter paused and remarked that they could not go back to pretending I was just a department head. I replied that I expected nothing less. When I left the hotel, the city felt exactly the same. Cars moved and people rushed along the sidewalks, unaware of the corporate shift that had just occurred. But inside the company where I had built my career, the balance of power had changed, and this time it rested on something solid. The agreement was signed quietly. There was no press release or internal announcement, just a licensing document routed through legal with my name where the company's name used to be. Core Shield was operational again, but now it answered to a different authority. By the next morning, the building felt different. It was not louder or calmer, but tighter, like a system running under direct observation. I returned to headquarters for the first time since being fired, using the executive elevator instead of the main employee entrance. Security did not question my presence, as my access had already been restored. I was not returning to my old department, but to the systems that actually mattered. Frank Harris met me outside the secure operations floor. He looked relieved but slightly uncomfortable as we walked. He admitted that he should have pushed back harder when Greg started cutting corners. I told him that he had pushed back as much as he could, but authority only works if someone is willing to listen. Inside the room, engineers stopped talking when they saw me. A few nodded and one smiled, but there was no applause. It was not that kind of moment. We stepped into the control room where the Core Shield monitoring dashboards glowed across the wall. Everything was green and stable for now. Frank warned me that they had a problem, and I told him to show me. He pulled up a configuration tree tied to a pending deployment. He explained that Greg had approved an optimization change the previous week. It had not gone live yet because the legal team froze it when the ownership issues surfaced. I scanned the code parameters, and my jaw tightened. I told him this was not an optimization, but a dangerous shortcut. Frank explained carefully that it was meant to reduce latency. I countered that it only reduced latency by skipping critical verification steps, which was not speed, but exposure. He nodded, admitting that was what he had told Greg. I asked him if Greg had listened, and Frank said no. I told him then the deployment does not ship. Frank explained that it had already been promised to two major clients, including one highly regulated financial group. I turned to him and said that those clients would have to wait, or they would walk. He warned me that would be painful. I replied that a security breach would be far more painful, and that pain was relative. By midday, the consequences of Greg's past decisions were surfacing everywhere. Compliance teams were flagging undocumented approvals, product managers realized timelines had been committed without proper sign-off, and engineers quietly admitted they had been told to bypass standard review processes temporarily. Shortcuts always have a way of becoming permanent disasters. The board reconvened that afternoon. This time, there was no Greg Myers in the room. His security badge had been deactivated earlier, and his company email was already being redirected to the legal department. Walter Cooper addressed the room, stating they were not there to assign blame, which everyone knew meant the exact opposite. He said they were there to restore control and asked for my assessment. I did not sugarcoat the situation. I told them they had promoted speed without governance, which might work in consumer technology but fails completely in encryption. I added that the good news was the damage was currently contained. One board member asked about the bad news. I replied that they would miss a quarter, maybe even two, but they would not lose their regulatory licenses, and they would not lose client trust. Silence followed my words, followed by nods of agreement around the table. Walter exhaled and asked what I needed. I told him I needed clear, actual authority and oversight over all encryption-related decisions, reporting directly to the board rather than to product managers or marketing executives who benefit from pretending risk does not exist. The board did not argue. The next few days were methodical. Systems were reviewed, approvals were reset, and teams were restructured deliberately. People who actually understood the technical work were placed back in positions where their voices carried weight. I did not reclaim my old role, as that role no longer existed. Instead, I sat in rooms I had never been invited to before, participating in budget meetings, risk committees, and client calls. 3 months later, no one talked about Greg Myers anymore. That is how you know a company has truly moved on. A name simply stops appearing in meetings, emails, and hallway conversations. His departure had been processed the same way his decisions were eventually handled, documented, reviewed, and closed. The company stabilized faster than the market analysts had expected. We missed a quarter, exactly as I had predicted. The stock dipped briefly, then leveled out. Clients grumbled about the delays, but they stayed because the security was guaranteed. Regulators asked detailed questions, received clear answers, and signed off on our compliance. There was no public scandal, just a quiet recalibration that went unnoticed by the outside world. Inside the building, everything had changed. My role was clear now. I was not managing people day to day, but sitting above that layer, where critical decisions could not hide behind artificial urgency or corporate buzzwords. Nothing moved forward without a documented technical rationale and my personal sign-off. At first, some sales executives bristled because they were used to selling ambition while I enforced real constraints. But constraints are what make systems work. In meetings, I spoke less than most, but when I did speak, it was specific, measurable, and tied to precedent. Over time, people stopped trying to argue around me and started preparing thoroughly before they spoke. That was the real shift in our culture. One afternoon, Frank Harris joined me for coffee in the atrium downstairs. It was not a formal meeting, just a brief pause in a busy week. He remarked that if Greg had not fired me, none of this would have happened. I stirred my coffee and replied that it was already happening, and Greg had only accelerated the reveal. Frank asked if I ever thought about what would have happened if I had fought Greg in the conference room that day. I told him that I would have lost, because you cannot win inside a broken structure. You can only expose it. By the end of the quarter, the board formalized a governance model that mirrored our informal practices. Technical authority was no longer subordinate to product timelines. Risk assessment was no longer a simple checkbox, but an actual gate. Other departments took notice of our success. I was invited to speak with teams I had never interacted with before, including the Mergers and Acquisitions Group and even Human Resources, who now consulted technical leadership before drafting executive contracts. They did so because they had learned what happens when they do not. One evening, as I packed up my things to leave, I passed the glass conference room where Greg had fired me. The glass walls and the table were the same, but the chairs had been replaced. I stood there for a moment, not out of nostalgia, but out of simple curiosity, trying to remember how I had felt walking out that day. I found that I could not recall the anger. What I remembered instead was the stillness afterward, the clarity, and the moment when fear never showed up because there was no reason for it. At home, life felt much quieter too. I slept better and stopped checking my phone compulsively. The work no longer followed me home like an unresolved equation. It stayed where it belonged, within defined boundaries. One night, I received a text message from a former colleague who had left shortly after Greg did. He wrote that I was right to stay calm and that watching it all from the outside, it finally made sense. I typed back a simple response, stating that systems do not respond to emotion. They respond to structure. The board chair, Walter Cooper, called me the following week. He said they were revisiting leadership training, specifically around decision authority, and asked if I would review the new framework. I told him I would. After the call ended, I realized that they were no longer asking me to fix an active problem. They were asking me to help prevent the next one. That is the difference between being useful and being valued. On my last walkthrough of the operations floor before the weekend, a new hire stopped me in the hallway. She admitted that people talked about what had happened, not as gossip, but as a lesson. She said they talked about how I did not raise my voice or threaten anyone, but simply let the rules work. I smiled faintly and told her that rules only work if someone is willing to enforce them. As I left the building that evening, the security lights reflected off the glass facade in steady, predictable patterns. The environment was controlled and secure. 15 years earlier, I had joined a company that wanted to build something resilient, but along the way, they had forgotten what that required. Getting fired was not the betrayal I once thought it was. It was simply the system correcting itself, using the only mechanism still available. They told me to step aside because they thought I was slowing them down, but they learned that I had been the one keeping the structure upright. When the noise finally died down, one truth remained. I did not take revenge, I restored balance.